We're going to talk recovery week nutrition with Dr. Kyle Pfaffenbach. Kyle, it's good to have you on the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast. Yeah, man, of course. I'm going to jump right in. This question's from Ken. He submitted it at TrainerRoad.com/podcast. You can do the same thing, or you can submit them on Spotify if you're listening there. Ken says, I'm a 62-year-old TrainerRoad athlete. My weight fluctuates between 148 and 155 pounds, and my FTP is 261. And he mentions it's an all-time peak, and thanks. Dude, I wish that's incredible fitness for a 62-year-old person. Ken, you're impressive, man. Way to go. I'm on a mid-volume master's plan, and master's plan, by the way, on TrainerRoad, you can make it so that you can only have a master's plan is 2 days of intensity per week of like high intensity. Mm-hmm. The rest is low intensity. With my last big event in 5 weeks from now, I'm rolling into my off week and have a nutrition question. While I realize you want to eat well for recovery, I've tended to put a lot of weight on during recovery weeks, and then I struggle to get it off and see a long season trend up to the higher range. My question is, what is the best approach to nutrition, both from a macro and calorie perspective, when in a low volume recovery week? My training load is usually around 350 to 400 TSS in a training week, and then down below 180 or so in recovery weeks. So he's looking at roughly a 50% decrease in those recovery weeks. So Ken asks, should I eat less so I don't, quote, balloon up, or is it, quote, good weight to put on, as long as I am eating good balance of carbs, protein, etc.? Thanks from Ken. This is one question of many on this topic that kind of go in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot to cover here. But the main things that I hear from athletes, they come into recovery weeks and they're like, my appetite is crazy. But I'm afraid to eat too much. Or during recovery week, should I eat less? Or should I change the composition of my meals since I'm not doing as much training load? I've heard a lot of different theories on this. You have the knowledge of what's going on in our bodies, then also the practical experience of coaching athletes across a wide spectrum, but especially the world's best athletes. Mm-hmm. So it'd be cool to kind of talk about like what our body is actually doing. Here's the bro science theory that I'll lay out for you, Kyle, and I want you to let me know if it's correct.
Hit me.
Like, you've been doing all this work for, let's just say, like 3 weeks, right? So we're talking about like a basic cycle here. Mm-hmm. 3 weeks of loading, and then you have this 1 week of off, where it's not fully off, you're still doing something, but it's definitely dropped down. High intensity work is gone. It's just low intensity work, and it's dropped down to roughly 50%. Is your body really like changing modes and switching into recovery mode for that whole week? And do we have to focus on fueling that recovery work, the patchwork that our body and the rebuilding that our body is doing during those weeks?
This is science and art, because we've talked about this a lot. So when you're reading Ken's question, I'm taking into consideration his body mass, his training volume, his age, his gender, where he's at in the season, where he wants to be, and he was really specific. He gave us a lot of information that is actually really important information that can help us tailor something along with it. So that's the first thing you want to try and do, is figure out, okay, where am I at? Check in with how I'm feeling, check in with my previous experience on recovery weeks and things like that. Check in with, like, some people get hungrier than other people during recovery weeks. Some people start to feel really flat during recovery weeks because just their sort of neurologic system isn't getting fired and getting the same stress that it's getting. Some people feel, so you really want to like kind of figure out what the scenario is: age, gender, training status, goals, time of the season, current body mass, goal body mass, and what's the level of training load I came off of and the level of fatigue that was associated with that. And then how do I individually sort of feel during down weeks? Do I get hungry? Do I get groggy? Do I get flat? Do I get really hyper and I have to like force myself to hold myself back? Mm. And those can mean different things. And that's probably beyond the scope of like what we can do with this discussion, but that's the sort of thing that your coach and your nutritionist would know from previous history and stuff like that. So that's kind of the first thing. You want to take in multiple factors into control. So So the question was, what's happening during that recovery week? Are people really needing to fuel recovery? What are they doing with recovery? And the reality is like, it's going to be different for different people, but different people are going to respond in different ways. So you just want to consider those things. And that's
a lot more. Sorry, that's a lot more deep. So a lot of the time we tend to take a really broad strokes approach to these sort of issues. And I'm not saying we as in TrainerRoad, I'm saying we as in athletes. You know what I mean? Like we'll just be like, during recovery week, eat less, or during recovery week, eat more. Yeah. But it sounds like you're really paying attention to a lot of different details. In the end, it's all about like, if you have data on how you've responded to these sort of things, in other words, like how an athlete has responded to those certain things, that seems like one of the most important components of what you're considering.
You have clarity with the goals or the things that you're trying to achieve as well, because that could be like a recovery week in your shoulder season is different than a recovery week or a down week in the middle of racing season, or heading into a full peak or something like that. Like he provided a bunch of really usable information. So he's basically saying, I don't know, like when this is going to drop in relation to when he sent the email, and he's saying this is 5 weeks from now, but basically he's mid-season and it sounds like he has a key thing that he wants to do really well in. And so we would take that into consideration versus, okay, you have 2 weeks off for recovery before we start our build again for next year or something like that. Those approaches are going to be a little bit different. So you do want to take kind of those things into consideration. Now, in terms of like actionable things that people should be thinking about, there's a couple things. One is that I ascribe to this sort of data set and idea that's sort of been laid out through really careful tracer studies, where they actually like follow individual amino acids and their incorporation into muscle tissue over various periods of time. And then we sort of get an idea of how people are adapting to exercise. And there's different theories for this. So one theory is that we get better at adapting as we gain adaptations. So if you think of like a training stimulus puts you into like negative protein synthesis, and recovery, you want protein synthesis from recovery to go above the debt you created, and whatever the difference is in that is going to be adaptation, basically.
Right.
And so you want to try and maximize those adaptations, and then the accumulation of those can change. And so there's a couple different theories. The one is, as we get into better shape, does exercise cause less detriment? So the down curve, if you think of like a flat line like this, and then you think of you work out and you have a deficit, and then you recover and you come above it like this. And then the difference in those curves would be adaptation.
Is the new baseline.
So the idea is like, if workout one was really deficit, and then the recovery maybe doesn't even match it, right?
Yeah.
But over time, this gets smaller to where it's the detriment or the breakdown that a workout causes is less, and your recovery is the same or better, then you create this separation and you gain training adaptations. The second way that you could do is do we get better at adapting? So for example, the down curve stays the same every workout, but the up curve gets bigger at every workout. And this is how we gain adaptations. And then the third theory, which is the one I ascribe to, the prevailing theory from a lot of these different people that study protein synthesis and training adaptations, is that it's the same. You stimulate the system, and then you recover from that, and you want to maximize the recovery so that you can maximize the adaptation. But accumulation of training effects occurs on a workout by workout basis, not because we get less training becomes less detrimental, or we get better at responding. And this isn't why I ascribe to it. I ascribe to it because physiologically, to me, it makes the most sense based on like what I've both observed in the field and both on the research that I've read. But mentally, the reason why I think it connects well with people is because they realize like every workout I do has a reason, and every workout I do, I get the benefit from. And that includes the first workout. Like if you haven't worked out for 6 months and then you do your first workout, your body's not capable of producing the load that you would eventually like to produce. That comes from training adaptations. But the stimulus to the system, in like a relative sense, the stimulus to the system and the recovery from the system, you get that benefit from the very first workout, and you get it from every workout. This is why, like, I would much rather have an athlete stack 6 months where 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, they're nailing B or C hard workouts than once every 2 weeks or once a week, they're an A++ workout. But their training is disrupted and inconsistent regardless, because we accumulate those training adaptations on a workout by workout basis. And how this ties back into protein intake and recovery is pretty interesting for a number of reasons. One, based on this theory, you have these periods of time where you basically have a 48 to 72 hour window after each workout where you're trying to maximize protein synthesis in order to recover from that individual workout. And so one of the things that athletes do a lot is they'll finish a really hard workout. One, they train too hard too often. And two, they finish a hard workout, they take a recovery drink, and they think recovery's done, where the recovery drink is actually the start of a recovery period, where the things you do, both from a training standpoint, a sleep standpoint, and a nutrition standpoint, for the next 48 to 72 hours are really going to dictate how well you respond and how much you get out of that individual effort. Now, it does appear, so even though you can think of them as these like individual episodes of stress and adaptation, there does seem to be, especially when we're really trying to like overreach and push and things like that, there does appear to be this accumulated effect where you do need a down week to kind of like, recover. And this goes back to periodization training. Like, it's much easier to see in practice than like what just the research or thinking about us of kind of like physiologic robots that always do the same thing all the time. Like, if you just looked at it based on the theory, the prevailing theory that I ascribe to, you would say, well, then you should just train consistently all the time, balance your training, and you'll just continue to get better until infinity, because and in practice, it doesn't work like that. We know that there's times when you want to be really tired and kind of pushing it, and then you get a down week and you feel better and you can kind of so it's kind of a mixture of those two things. So when you have the opportunity to do this down week, what you really want to be focused on is giving your body the nutrients that it needs and getting the sleep that you need to really take advantage of less volume. And sort of, not only, it's not that you're adapting to the previous 3 weeks of training, it's that you're taking an opportunity to become fully rested so that you can take advantage of all the accumulated effects over the previous 3 weeks individual workouts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then also prepare yourself for what's to come. That
would by definition prepare yourself for what's to come, because what happens is that the more stimulus you can apply to the system, theoretically, the greater the response is. So as a person gets into shape over a month, they do like a 3-week block and they have 1 week off, and then they come back for the start of their next training block. And the idea is that you can now stimulate the system to a greater degree so that you can get more of an adaptation, because you have a greater capacity to stimulate the system. And that's because you've accumulated 3 weeks of training and given yourself a bunch of rest and sleep.
Yeah, it's the whole concept of progressive overload, right? And that's what our body needs to be able to drive the sort of change and adaptation that we hope to have, which is getting faster on a bike, right?
And the key is the key to that progressive overload concept is this thing called supercompensation. That lots of this is like exercise phys 101, which is the idea that when we stimulate a system, the system overdoes the response within the biological ceiling that we're genetically capable of producing, which means that like no matter how much I eat, train, sleep, I can't become LeBron. But I can maximize my ability to gain adaptations within my biological ceiling. So there's multiple factors that you have to take, and that takes into consideration my biological ceiling at my current age versus younger ages versus when I get older and all these different other sub factors. And so but that idea of supercompensation is actually really important because a lot of people, especially cyclists, runners, there's this common misconception that if I exercise hard all the time, then when I go at my goal race pace, it will quote unquote feel easy. And that's actually not the case, because when you're going too hard too often, you're stimulating systems that aren't the primary systems you use during the middle part of your race, or maybe the beginning of the part of your race or something like that. And you just start to take for granted that middle power band, for example. And you say, no, if I can do 500 watts for 2 minutes, then I should be able to do 250 watts to infinity. But you've actually only trained your ability to do 500 watts for 2 minutes. You haven't trained your ability to do 250 watts for really long periods of time. And so,
there's cascading trickle down effects to a certain extent. But boy, we're really good. Us athletes are really good at overestimating.
Yeah, that's what they call it.
We overestimate the impact.
Yeah. It's a crossover effect. And this became very clear when like HIIT training became. So there's a super important paper from the early 2000s where they showed they took non-exercising, healthy college, like average healthy college males, and they had them exercise for 15 minutes. You may be familiar with this work, but they had them exercise for a total of 15 minutes over a 2-week period. But that all of that 15 minutes was all out. And the way they did all out, and this audience will appreciate this more than others, is they just did repeat Wingate tests.
Oh my gosh.
Exactly. These are 30-second tests where the resistance on the bike is set based on body mass, and you go all out for 30 seconds. And the most they ever did in one session, I think, was 4 or 5 repeats. So,
that's hard.
It's hard.
It's not like going out and doing a sprint workout, by the way. Like these Wingate 30-second ones are, it's absolutely everything that your body has for 30 seconds. It's even more than a sprint.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No worries.
Sorry. So they had ample rest in between, but they never did more than like 4 or 5 in a session. And it was a total of 15 minutes over a 2-week period. And what they showed, it was super interesting because they showed all these improvements in aerobic capacity. So it was improved time to exhaustion at 70% VO2. There was improved VO2. And then what made this study special is they actually did a bunch of muscle biopsies, and they looked at gene expression and protein expressions of critical aerobic enzymes and proteins, and they showed an increase in those too. And of course, everybody took this to the nth degree where they were like, nobody should be doing long, slow runs anymore for marathon training. We should just be doing HIIT training all the time, and that's the way to go. And so, and this is what you were referring to before, where like, if you do a lot of really high intense speed work, you will get some crossover effect. Like these systems do talk to each other, but you're missing that thing that you need really specifically to do great in your race for an extended period of time if you don't train it.
Right.
But the reason why people don't train it is because the RPE of it seems to be quite low. So if you're like, well, I can maintain 250 for an hour, but for this race, I need to maintain 250 for 2.5 hours with some climbing. I'm going to go train at 350 and 400 so that's easy, instead of saying, I'm actually going to train at 240 or 235 for 4 hours. And that's how you work that up because of supercompensation, if that makes sense. Like you train a little bit below what the capacity is, and then you will overdo the response and gain that new capacity. It makes more sense.
More training volume as a result of that, right?
Exactly. You increase your capacity to then handle training volume and all these different things, but it takes a long time because you're making these small changes on a workout by workout basis, and you accumulate fatigue during this time. And so sometimes you need to rest. And that's what that role of that rest week is. It's not like your body, like you work out on day 1 of your 3-week training block, and then you wait to respond to the day 1 training until you get to your week 4 rest week. That's like, I hear that sometimes where it's like, oh, I need to recover from the previous 3 weeks of training. It's like, no, you just need rest because you've accumulated fatigue and you've taken on a bunch of load and now you just need rest. But you've adapted to those training sessions. You just now need a chance to like fully accumulate those adaptations and rest. And now all of a sudden you feel great heading into the next block, break yourself down, you get your build back up. It makes a lot of sense in weight training, but it doesn't make sense for some reason to people with aerobic sports where I always use this example in my classes because my students get a kick out of it. So when I was like 35, I've never lifted. I've always just like run and stuff like that. I've always had a weak upper body. So I was like, you know what? I'm sick of like having to do the small plates on the bench press, right? The 25s, the 35s. Like I want to get to where you can put the 45s on and do some reps. So I'm going to get to what I think it's like 135. It's not very much at all. But I was like, I didn't set my goal to like be able to rep out 135. I didn't start with 160 so that 135 could then feel easy and I could rep it out.
Right.
I had to start below that and build up to it, but I got super compensation along the way. So the whole point of this conversation, to tie it back into that recovery week, is one, make sure the workouts that you're doing are specifically tailored to the system that you're trying to gain adaptations to, and then do basically submaximal efforts within those systems and let your body's ability to supercompensate give you adaptations above and beyond what your current level is. And then 3, really take seriously your recovery during the training block and think of the recovery week as more of a rest week than a recovery week, because the recovery is occurring all the time. The most important window of recovery starts 15 minutes in, basically, like someone's going to get me on this, but basically 15 minutes after the training session ends till about 48 to 72 hours. And that's why like a lot of good programs, and it sounds like, the master's program is like this, they'll have about 48 to 72 hours between workouts that stimulate a specific system in a specific way. So you can still ride 7 days a week or 6 days a week or 5 days a week. It's just what systems on the bike that you're stimulating specifically, there needs to be variability in that. And then you need to know what the prescribed effort level is within that variability so that you can take advantage of super compensation and not just always thinking like more is better.
Makes perfect sense.
And so
on the new, sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
So I was just going to say, so really recovery is this pillar of training that is not an afterthought. And it's really something that needs to be taken into consideration depending on the level that you're training at and how much like off the bike sacrifices that you want to make. Because the reality is if you have a really hard session on a Friday, you're not fully recovered from that session until maybe Sunday. And that's right when a lot of like alterations in sleep, increase in alcohol consumption, changes in diet take place often on the weekends when people are out of their routines and being social and things like that. So if you know that's going to be the case, then your key workouts need to be on Tuesday and Thursday, not Friday or coming off on Monday. So there's different things to take into consideration in regards to that. So recovery is always going, especially from a nutrition standpoint. I'm going to stop there because now we can talk about what the nutrition is for the rest week specifically, but contextualizing it within this broader discussion, I think is important.
Yeah, so we have the pathway behind us so we can understand what the body's trying to do and how it's going to be recovering. And you're giving it that rest. You're no longer dosing it with that sort of stress. So should we change the way that we eat during a recovery week?
Yes.
Assuming that, and there's this assumption that like you have what you eat to be able to, and assuming that it's got a good macro ratio and everything else to support life. And then you largely fuel with carbohydrate, the additional caloric burn that you bring in with training.
Exactly.
Right. So then logic would point to a week with less
Yes.
training, that less carbohydrate intake. Is it really just as simple as that? Or do you
Pretty much, yeah.
commonly suggest other approaches or anything else that you would suggest for a person during a recovery week?
Yeah. So at the most basic level, at the highest level, if you were just going to say, this is a recovery week, what do I need to do? I want to prioritize rest. I want to prioritize taking care of myself mentally. So lots of like just medication, relaxation, walks, outdoor time, stuff that we know like calms the central nervous system. And that's not my like expertise. That's part of recovery. And then from a nutrition standpoint, we want to maintain fat intake, maintain protein intake, modulate carbohydrate intake. Because the carbs are really needed for your high intensity exercise, your high intensity outputs, making sure that you're starting exercise with high glycogen, because there's some evidence that like your brain likes it when your body has higher glycogen, especially when you're going into key efforts. And so basically what that is like the studies show if you there's a couple studies that demonstrate that if you start exercise with lower carbohydrate stores, even if that exercise doesn't completely deplete those stores, it can compromise performance having less glycogen in the system to start with.
Yeah, makes sense.
So carbohydrates. Now, the other important thing, or just to like quell a concern, is, well, where does the energy come to fuel the recovery? And it comes from fat. So we talk about how like fat is a fuel that's used under moderate conditions. We know that fat is the fuel of choice overnight when glucose levels and insulin levels and there's no food coming in and those types of things. So we know that the energy demand to fuel recovery does not exceed the capacity of fat to supply fuel at the rate required to meet the needs of that recovery. Right.
That's right.
And so that's what you do, is you make sure that you get enough fat. And then you still need a certain amount of glucose for your brain. And just because our bodies like glucose, but that glucose level can come down significantly. And then basically what you're trying to do is meet what is your basal metabolic rate, or your metabolic rate for what your body needs to stay alive, plus maybe a little bit extra, because it needs extra fuel for recovery because you're resting, you're trying to take advantage of that, plus what you would use walking around and things like that throughout the day. But if you're off the bike and you're not exercising hard, unless you're like severely calorically restricted for a long period of time and you're severely under in essential body fat, an otherwise healthy individual that's eating a pretty healthy meal, we have plenty of body fat to fuel a way more like, people come up with these sayings where like we have a lean individual has enough body fat to fuel 30 marathons or something like that. And obviously it's looking at it purely from bioenergetic standpoint. Like if you, I tell my classes this, like if I told you to just walk until you couldn't walk anymore, you would stop walking, not because you ran out of energy. You'd stop walking because of some neurological issue or central nervous system
or a blister,
down, or sleep deprivation or injury, or, that's what we have a lot of fuel. So the fueling part of it, I think, is either properly rated or overrated.
Interesting.
The carbohydrate part of it, I think, is the hardest part to get over, because you want to make sure you're fueled for recovery and you don't want to lose your sharpness. And you will feel a little bit flatter and with less carbohydrate. And it seems like you're eating less. The key really is the protein, because we have plenty of fat and we're still going to make sure that we get enough fat. Typically it's 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight. The protein is where, like, if you typically average 1.5 grams of protein per day, for example, which is almost twice the amount of the RDA, that's what I would check in on first. I would basically say maybe that goes to 1.8 or even 2 for a larger, younger individual. So if I had a male athlete in their 20s that's coming off a huge training block, we'd probably really focus on making sure we got enough calories with fat, making sure we had enough carbohydrates to keep the brain happy and meet daily caloric requirements. But we're not loading up on a ton of carbohydrates because training's low. And then let's go to 2 grams per kilogram body weight protein. In Ken's case, in this case, with a leaner individual, I would say go to 1.6 or 1.7, even 1.8 grams per kilogram body weight, somewhere between 1.6 and 1.8 with protein. Make sure you're at the 1.1 grams, 1.2 grams kilogram body weight of fat. And then probably without like talking to him or knowing him or anything, you could do 40 to 50 grams of carbs per meal. That's 120 to 150 grams of carbs per day. It's about a cup of rice per meal, 2 or 3 pieces of toast per meal. So it's not no carbs, but it's also not like carb loading like most high volume training athletes. I mean, like 350 to 400 TSS. You're eating a lot more than above your metabolic rate. Yeah.
Yeah. So this gets into, and I'm going to throw a couple wrenches in the spokes here on this one, but maybe not on this first one. This probably isn't a wrench. This is helpful.
Okay, cool.
So I think that athletes, we talk about fueling the work and how crucial it is.
Yeah.
There's a temptation, Kyle, that during recovery week, and because these are weeks where, you know, if you're training 5 days a week, you might train 4 days a week, or maybe you do train 5, but they're short sessions and they're really low in intensity.
Exactly.
Do you advise them to still, because, and keep in mind, again, like when we talk about caloric intake and trying to balance the equation of what you're burning on the bike, in anything that's like mid intensity and up, you're probably, it's very much predominantly carbohydrate that you're burning.
Yes.
If it's lower intensity, it's going to still not just be a pure fat thing. You're still burning carbohydrate to a certain degree, right? System of faders, not switches, as we've talked about before. No worries. And with that in mind, do you advise that during these like easy, shorter rides that athletes don't fuel at all on the bike? Because then I feel like that's where things get really tricky and where you get hunger pains.
Yeah.
And then you look at the end of the day and you aren't even close to that 120 to 140 grams of carbs.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is what I've talked to up until this point has all been off the bike. Mm-hmm. These are things that are at meals. So if you're eating 3 meals a day, you want to increase your protein. You're maybe at the higher end of normal fat range. And then carbohydrates, you still are getting some carbohydrates at each meal, but not as much as you typically would if you were fully trying to load up for like a big day, right? So like if you typically have a big training day on Tuesday, you're trying to eat carbs at every meal, maybe starting Sunday night, definitely all day Monday, because that's just the number of meals that are like to get you to where you want to be on Tuesday. That's what's not happening. On the bike, I think you really need to take this thing into consideration, because a lot of people will be like, oh, it was just an hour and I barely tried and it was totally fine. But that still has like caloric consequences. And if you're under in calories, you will compromise recovery because your body will cut corners. Like obviously the number one things that it's going to fuel is brain activity, heart activity, liver activity, kidney activity, like your essential functions, right? Then it's like we use a lot of energy just to keep ourselves alive. And what happens if you're under fueling during a recovery period or just in general is that a person will say, well, I stopped losing weight, so I must not be under fueling. And that's not necessarily true. You can under fuel and be weight stable, but you're compromising other areas that you don't want to compromise, like fully recovering and doing all these. It's almost like, I don't know if this makes sense in terms of, I'm coming up with this analogy off the top of my head, but it's basically the body goes like, well, we have these essentials and we're going to leave the optionals off. All the bells and whistles that are the small percentages that really make you the best athlete you can possibly be. We're going to leave all those out because we have to take care of these essential things. And there's just not enough money to go around. And the budget cuts, when budget cuts come, they're going to come from the non-essentials. And we want those non-essentials. That's the thing we care about as athletes, is like gaining those little incremental things, because after a year or 2 or 3 years, like those things accumulate in a way that really has meaning. So we don't want to cut those corners. And what happens is when training volume drops during a recovery week, we don't want to underfuel. And the reason why underfueling happens a lot is because people don't use gram per kilogram body weight recommendations for what they should be consuming in terms of fat, carbohydrates, and protein, and really manipulating the carbohydrate version of that. They use a set number of calories and then percentages. And so if you say, well, my Whoop or my Aura or whatever you're using says that, my training's reduced and I've gone from burning 2,500 calories a day to 1,800 calories a day. If you're going off protein need to make up 30% of 1,800 calories, that may actually not be enough protein for what you're trying to accomplish during that week, because the calories have come down. And so the total amount of protein has come down because you're working off a relative amount. So it's really important to maintain the grams per kilogram body weight of protein throughout that week, or even up it. There's also, you want to maintain the fat grams per kilogram body weight or up it, and then have some level of carbohydrates, and that's off the bike. And then on the bike, there's some cute things that you can do. Like if your coach is really, if maybe you're trying to do some fat adaptation, you could do a low carbohydrate ride. And if you're not going all out, like if you're not in zone 4, zone 3 to 5 and doing repeats and things like that, maybe you're not at 90 grams per hour, but you can still be at 30 grams per hour. 1 gel per hour is not too much to ask. And you're maintaining that connection with your central nervous system and we're going to talk about this, I think. You're maintaining that connection with your central nervous system, that carbohydrates are coming in to the system, and that you're not just like now introducing these new odd stresses during a week when you're actually trying to recover and get rest.
Yeah, kind of the last time you'd want, of all
you don't
the
want
times to throw something new and crazy.
Exactly. You don't want to introduce
that's not the time
stress.
to do it.
So if you've created really good habits for fueling on the bike, maintain those to some degree and to some degree of normalcy, even when the volume comes down, because you don't want to throw new stimulus at the system when you're trying to maximize rest. And
that's, makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And then what happens, the reason why people get hungry is because they're not eating enough protein. And so protein, there's this whole field of people that study the ability of different macronutrients to make us feel full and keep us feeling full. And protein's number one. So it's satiating and satiety. It's number one on the list compared to the others. So it makes us feel full in the moment while we're eating it. So it leads to people unconsciously putting their fork down and saying, I'm full. And then it also keeps people full longer before they either A, start to feel hungry, or B, voluntarily start eating snacks. And there's these really cool studies. They're super old now. We talked about them like back when I was in grad school, which is like farther away than I wish it was at this point. But there's all these studies where they would kind of like in very sneaky ways feed similar meals that had different macronutrient compositions to the same individuals that would come back 3 times under the same kind of base conditions. And then they would eat that meal, stop when they feel full, and they would measure how many calories and how much food and stuff like that. And then they'd put them in a room with just this awesome looking buffet with all kinds of different foods. And they would basically start a clock and time how long it was. And you just tell a person like, eat till you're full, go sit over here. And then whenever you feel like it, go to that buffet table and pick whatever types of foods you want. And there were like healthy foods on that buffet table and junk foods, like high calorie sort of junk foods.
Yeah.
And what they found was like protein is the best. And there's been a whole bunch of different iterations of similar studies. That wasn't just like one study I'm talking about. So we know that protein makes us feel full and keeps us feeling full for longer. And then the second thing is we know that fat is the worst, which is interesting because it has 2.5 times calories. So calories is not what makes us feel full. It's other biological signals and physiologic signaling and things like
How
that.
interesting. Because fat is commonly known as like the thing that like, take in fat and that's what's going to be satiating to you. And protein,
Right. So now
at least in these experiments, protein
fat will
is showing
slow
that
down digestion, which can impact satiation and fullness and those types of things. And so like, if you like eat, if you took a sugar bolus on its own or sugar bolus mixed with fat, the fat would like slow down the absorption and maybe moderate the glucose spike from that. This is like putting almond butter on an apple slice or putting almond butter on a banana slice. It's going to change the blood glucose profile. But fat in and of itself is not satiated. I mean, people that have like seen how much volume of French fries you can eat in one sitting, this. Like, there's no protein. It's full of carbohydrates and it's full of fat. And you're like, why can't I, like, this is so good. Like, I just like, it's not even like I can't stop. It's like, I don't want to stop because you're not satiated. Right. And so
totally makes sense.
So a lot of times what we see is when we increase or when I work with athletes, I'll speak for myself. What I see is like, when especially endurance athletes are often under fueling in protein because they think it's like a bro thing, like a strength athlete thing. And they think it's going to make them big and there's all these different things. Well, what they're missing there is like our response is specific to the stimulation that we place our system under. So unless you're lifting for hypertrophy, you're probably not going to gain like a ton of extra muscle mass. And if you do gain some muscle mass, as a response of increasing protein, it's probably muscle mass you needed to gain to increase your ability and efficiency on the bike. And so we increase protein, but one of the things we see with increased protein is just you're less hungry. And so if you up that a little bit and you up fat a little bit so that you make sure you're not getting too low of calories, even if you have slightly increased caloric need during that week, but the majority of people could just go to recommended fat levels, increase their protein levels, 40 grams per meal, 40 to 60 grams per meal of carbohydrate. And you would be, I think, surprised at how good you'll feel during the recovery week and coming off the recovery week. And I guess I could have said that in 5 seconds at the beginning of it, but it's more fun to talk about how we arrived there and why we arrived there. Because then, at least the way my brain works, you have a higher chance of buy-in and people sticking to it if you kind of explain the reasons why.
Yeah. Before we go into the next point here, I just want to kind of recap some basic principles, some guiding principles from all that could
there's
help.
One more addition here that I want to make sure we add. That's kind of
cool. Oh, cool.
So yeah, do your recap and then we'll add this one.
Okay, sounds good.
Thing. Yeah.
Good. So main thing to keep in mind here is the fact that your body still has important work to do, like staying alive and also recovering. And you're making space for what's going to come. And then you're also getting rid of that accumulated small deficit that starts to add up over time. You're also getting rid of that sort of fatigue. The way that you do that is making sure that you are fueling yourself adequately to be able to carry out all those tasks. Best way to do it during that time is to continue fueling yourself. Don't skip meals. Don't do that sort of thing. And instead, prioritize increasing your protein intake, maybe up to 2 to 2-ish grams per kilogram of body weight. Increase toward the top range of the fat intake that you would normally would. And then your carbohydrate is just naturally going to drop because you're not taking in as much because you're not training as much. And then throughout the week, in terms of what you're eating, you don't need to carb load. We're looking at roughly somewhere for this athlete, at least in this case, around 120, 140 grams per day. It looks like a normal carb intake for an athlete that isn't preparing for some sort of an event and taking in a lot. So this isn't the time to just cut back. This isn't a time to just eat greens for the week, and that's all you're going to do. No. There's a lot of social pressure that exists to do that. And then there's this fear that we also have, and maybe this doesn't jive with what you're going to talk about here, but there's this fear that I see a lot of athletes have. And even this was mentioned here in Ken's question, that they balloon, quote, in weight during this recovery week. And
balloon up or blow up, this idea of blowing up. Yeah.
And I kind of want to get into this over the course of a week, during that week, if an athlete really is like able to gain, to quote, blow up or gain a significant amount of weight, it seems I've heard of this concept that I really tend to logically agree with, and I don't know how you feel about it, but instead of looking at the scale every single day, it's running an average of your weight, and it's that average is spread out over weeks, and it's looking at it from that perspective rather than a sort of day by day or even week to week basis. Because it seems unrealistic to me that Ken would be increasing significantly in weight in just 1 week. How do you feel about that?
So there's a few things specific to this reader and Ken. The one thing is like, he may just be underweight. And
that's a good point.
When he backs off training and eats properly, he may just be getting back to a set point that his body wants to be at. Now, it might not be a number that he's decided he wants his body to be at for peak performance. And this is why we never have goal weights necessarily. We have processes that we put into place that allow the body to get to where the body wants to get to at the time that it's at. I call it turning the screws. There's ways to turn the screws tighter and get into the realm of body weights that are unsustainable year round. But for the most part, we're not trying to have like big off-season weights, big in-season weights, big strength phase weights, we don't set goal weights for those types of things. We follow the nutrition and we let people's talent and we let their individual body do the thing that we know it can do really well already. So the one thing is that like if he backs off on training and he starts eating a lot more protein relative to total calories and he's getting some rest and his weight goes up, it may just be that he's underweight right now. He's under fueling when he's in the middle of these big training blocks. The other thing is that our weight, now different people have different sensitivities to this, but weight can fluctuate anywhere from 2 to 6 pounds in a 24-hour period. And that's based on sodium intake, it's based on food intake, it's based on water intake, it's all these different types of things. So weighing yourself every day is not recommended and it's not necessarily discouraged. It's more of like, you have to know what you can mentally handle. If you even objectively can say, well, I know my weight can fluctuate 4 to 6 pounds a day, but I really live and die by the scale, then you can't weigh yourself every day because you'll just drive yourself crazy because of these natural fluctuations. But if you're the type of person that can just look at the scale as information and then you can just put it in a spreadsheet and forget about it until it's time to track trends and look at it in a more comprehensive way, then yeah, you can get away with it. Like it's just part of people's daily routine. The other thing is that like, if you really want to see how wild this is, you should weigh yourself all throughout the day. Like weigh yourself every hour for a 24-hour period and watch just how much your weight fluctuates, and weigh yourself before you pee and after you pee and before you take and after you take. All these different things cause a lot of weight fluctuations. And so weigh yourself before you go to bed and then first thing in the morning after you pee, like easily 3 or 4 pound difference. Just like that. And you would think that you're in that you just don't want to apply so much meaning to that. What you want to be looking at is, as you suggested, is the trends over time. Now, is there one right trend to look at for everybody? Probably not. What I would say is like, you have to figure out what your kind of what's going to work best with your brain. Do you need to follow it every day? And can you disassociate it with those day-to-day fluctuations? Can you mentally handle that? Or is it even to a point where you need to weigh yourself, but have like your partner or significant other look at it and write it down and you don't get to see it, for example?
Somebody needs to make an app for this where it pairs with your scale. Your scale never actually gives you the number. And all it does is
this
it
is
just
such a good
logs
idea.
It just logs in the background.
It just logs in
and
the
then
background.
instead of ever giving you a number, it gives you like a visual representation of like of where things are going.
Totally.
And I think that would work way better with all of our psychologies.
Yeah, this is like, and I know like you can.
Should we just stop what we're doing now, Kyle, and make
exactly.
that? You and I? Like, there we go. Yeah, cool.
Let's like develop that API and then we'll sell to Garmin and retire.
Yeah.
So those things you want to take into consideration. So it's really like, it'd be really interesting to see where Ken's weight settled if he always knew he was getting enough protein each day, always knew he was getting enough fat, modulating carbohydrates based on training volume, that both in block and rest weeks. And then he was also taking his recovery drink, working on his sleep, all those different types of things. People that are getting these really large fluctuations in weight or ballooning up during rest weeks, there's probably multiple factors that are going into that. They may be more hydrated just because they're drinking the same amount of water, but they're off the bike. They may have just come off a really hard week. So a lot of times, like if you have a 3-week block, the third week is the hardest, and then you go into the down week, and there could be like edema and muscle damage and inflammation associated with that. So we often see weight gain after ultra events.
Oh,
People are
interesting.
like, how am I blowing up? Like you either say balloon up or blowing up. It seems to be the terminology, but how am I gaining weight? I just did a stage race where I was riding 150 miles a day, and now I weigh more than I weighed when I was on the starting line. It's like, well, you just have like massive muscle damage to your system. And so there's going to be inflammation, there's going to be edema, there's going to be retention. There's also probably going to be somewhere this response of like, I'm holding on to every single one of these calories I get. Because your lizard brain doesn't know if that it was 7-day stage race. It might think this is the new normal. Like
totally.
What Lockie's doing right now, riding across Australia, is amazing from an energetic standpoint, and what he's doing and what that is going to do to sort of his like the relationship between his like conscious brain and his lizard brain and what he's going through.
And like so, what Lael Wilcox just did, riding around the world, you know, like it's just
exactly
your body, is changing.
So what we want to try and do,
perhaps,
sorry.
And Kyle, one other thing too that I've noticed, I talked about the salad thing. A lot of the time during recovery week, everyone suddenly goes super hard on the quote healthy foods, right?
So your fiber is up.
Their fiber intake just goes up substantially because prior to that it was like 6 bowls of cereal, you know what I mean, to like get the carbs that you needed, and now that's being replaced, and as a result, you put a bunch of fiber in the system, you're also holding on to a whole lot more stool like within your body as well.
I mean, if your habits significantly change, like the residue level of your diet changes, the effort level of your diet changes, there's changes. We are not simple, just like math problems, right? It's not like what you've always been told, where if you eat less calories, you have to lose weight. There are people that are chronically under eating and are weight stable. It can be hard for that person to realize they're under fueling because they are using the scale to determine whether they're well fueled or not. And that's just not the way it works. Like if you start eating a lot more protein, you are getting the proper amount of calories and you're taking care of your sleep and stress levels and things like that. Weight oftentimes doesn't change, but all of a sudden how you feel and how the workouts are going improves significantly. That's because of proper fueling. So if all of a sudden you get to this rest week and you throw out everything that you normally do and you make all these drastic changes, plus you stop exercising, of course there's going to be like alterations in weight, metabolism, like just overall feeling, all these different types of things. So what we want to try and do is alter the training load, but keep some of these fundamental nutrition processes and sleep processes in place. Because again, we're trying to like get the tail end of the adaptations that we need from the last workout and the last couple workouts. That's bleeding into that 72 hour from the last super hard workout. But we're also trying to like rest and really recover from these like weeks of training. And the last thing you want to do is like shortchange. You want to shortchange the system on protein and calories during the time when you're really trying to get as rest and replenished as you can possibly be. And the thing with Ken is like, so let's say he's between 148 and 155, and then he comes out of a rest week at 158. But within 4 days, he's back to 155. So who cares? Your body needed whatever it was doing during that time. It needed that weight and that change. As long as you're getting enough protein, enough fat, and those types of things. You're not looking to like get to your race weight during a rest week. You're looking to recover. Because getting to race weight and like creating like a responsible caloric deficit to achieve a particular weight that either you're hopefully letting your body settle into naturally, or worse, if you've said, I want to be this weight, and now you're forcing your body to get down to that weight, it's stressful. So that by definition is not rest. Like that's not a rest week. You're adding stress to the system. So I find these things really interesting because like the other thing you'll see a lot of times in the off season or during recovery weeks is the opposite, where it's like, I'm just going to eat everything in sight. That's not necessarily the right approach either. You still want to be eating healthy, whole foods within the macronutrients, but you want to have adjusted those macronutrients appropriately.
That makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Did we cover the cute details?
No. So the last thing that you could do, which is actually kind of like this might have come from like a consensus statement from International Society of Sports Nutrition or some reputable source where they were basically like, what are the things that athletes can do to like squeeze every last bit out of recovery or adaptation. And it brings me to that thing of if you're meeting the amount of protein that you need to meet. So in Ken's case, if he was getting 1.6, he'd be around 120. Like that's a lot of protein for a 150-pound person, 120 grams a day. That would be kind of the upper end of what we're looking at. And so if Ken says, oh, I never get that much protein and this sort of thing. Well, one is like, if you're decreasing protein relative to total calories based on a percentage, then you could be under consuming in protein. That's one of the things that can make you hungry. The other thing that can make you hungry is under fueling on the bike, what little exercise you are doing. So that can also make you feel hungry. The other thing is just not getting enough calories, or that can also kind of contribute to making you feel hungry. And the cute thing that you can do during really heavy periods of training and during your rest week is that protein as a nutrient has the ability to stimulate protein synthesis in and of itself, in the independent of insulin and independent of exercise stimulus. So like if you eat a bolus of protein, you get some protein synthesis just based on the ability of protein to stimulate activation of like things like mTOR. I know you've asked about that before and maybe talked about it in previous episodes. So there's like molecular activation of protein synthesis. And based on what I can find anecdotally, or based on what I've observed anecdotally, this is where the myth of not being able to absorb more than 20 or 30 grams of protein in a single meal comes from. Because what it is that like, if I eat 10 grams of protein and protein synthesis goes to level 5, and then I eat 20 grams of protein synthesis goes to level 10. But if I eat 40 grams of protein, it stays at level 10. It doesn't go to level 20. So there's a ceiling to protein's ability to turn on protein synthesis. And a lot of people have misinterpreted that as an inability to absorb protein. We absorb it all. There's just a ceiling to what it gets.
Sure.
And there was just a super important paper that came out this year or maybe late last year that showed we absorb the amino acids in 100 grams of protein if you eat 100 grams of protein in one sitting, which is a lot of protein.
That's right.
I don't necessarily recommend that. It's like eating
increasing
the John Candy steak from the Great Outdoors.
It's a competition steak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last thing is that like, so that give or take roughly the effect of protein to turn on protein synthesis lasts about 3 hours. So one of the cute things you can do during really heavy periods of times of training and other things is to just get a 20-gram bolus of protein every 3 hours when you're awake. So what that ends up looking like is like 20 grams of protein at breakfast. For Ken, for example, would be 20 grams of protein at breakfast, 20 grams after whatever recovery ride he did, 20 grams at lunch, 20 grams snack, 20 grams at dinner, and 20 grams before he goes to bed. And that's 120 grams of protein in 20-gram doses, roughly spread out throughout the day.
Which for his weight actually gets really close to 2 grams per kilogram, somewhere around there.
So that would be sort of like one approach if you were really going like, well, I have to have proteins. I have to keep my protein synthesis up. But you're under those circumstances, you're avoiding big blood glucose spikes, which lead to big insulin spikes, which lead to a suppression of fat breakdown and a promotion of fat storage. So this is why for recreationally active individuals, we have people that just listen to this and aren't hard training. These are some of the reasons why higher, increasing the amount of protein in your diet daily, pinning kind of your fat at a healthy level, and then being really careful with not only the amount of carbohydrates, but when you're consuming them, is like a pretty good approach at achieving what your body wants to be at in terms of a healthy body weight, because you're getting more protein now, which suppresses hunger and keeps you fuller for longer. You're not suppressing fat use, and you're not suppressing fat breakdown and promoting fat storage with all these insulin spikes throughout the day. So you use a little bit more of your body fat as a fuel source, which is totally appropriate. It's what it's there for. And you're probably not eating as much overall because you're just more satiated and you have less of a desire to eat, especially between meals, because your meals are high in protein.
Yeah, man, all makes sense. And turkey stocks are now going up through the roof. It's a great way to do it. Yeah. This is awesome, Kyle.
Okay, good.
We had another question that we were going to cover, but I think we're going to save it for the next one because
you want to do it? Okay.
I feel like we've this one's so neat and tidy on covering everything about recovery or nutrition week that it's dialed.
Yeah.
Next one we'll cover the next time with you. It'll be really good.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it with
That's
people.
a super
it's an
fun
interesting
topic.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be great. Kyle, thanks a bunch for joining us on this one. I'm going to put the link down to Kyle's Instagram. He doesn't really post on it, but you never know. He might post at some point and you'll really like it.
Get better at it.
It's all right. There's no pressure.
So it never even crosses my mind.
Yeah. And now the other thing I want to put out to listeners too is Kyle and I have been talking about, and also with Dr. Chris Minson, also I've been speaking with him about this, about doing like a tour to go do some lab tests, which would be kind of fun, and to do like some different things. If you guys want to see what sort of tests you want to see done, Kyle, I don't know if they do muscle biopsies there or if they do it. I think they do it over there. Yeah,
that is beyond our ability at this point. Okay. We don't really have a lot of. So the lab I have is at Eastern Oregon University. That's my home institution. We call it the LEAP. I'm super proud of this acronym. It's a Laboratory for Exercise Assessment and Performance. And nice. For the LEAP, it's applied testing. So but we have some kind of cool capabilities, and then we're limited in some ways. So we don't do as much big blood draw stuff and muscle biopsy stuff. We'd have to find some collaborators to do that with.
Or we don't have to. I'm super happy to hear that you guys don't have that. And that's really
exactly.
Okay with me, so,
yeah. I mean, the issue is not even like getting that tissue. It's then the cost and skill required to analyze that tissue in the way desired. So I
thought you were going to express pity for my torn up muscle thereafter from having a giant straw stuck into it. But yeah,
which I always say doesn't. I've actually had one done. Have you ever had one done?
No. And people have asked for it a lot of the time because I have this crazy high lactate production. Like crazy high. So everybody has this in their mind. Like we talked about it before, and they're like, oh, he must just be pure fast twitch. And that's like what it is. And, so we have, there's lots of.
That'd be interesting.
Fun
but there
things
might be non-invasive ways we can test that.
I'm all for it. If you want to hear any of that with Dr. Chris Minson, it'll be a heat training. We could do a lot of different things.
Cool.
If you want to see these sort of things happen, let us know in the comments what sort of things you'd like us to test. I might be able to bring truly world-class like athletes along with, because I'm like an average guy, but then we could bring somebody that's like truly not average. That could be really fun. He's college age. He's just an absolute beast of an athlete. Could be fun. If people are interested in this, it'd be really fun. It'd be cool to create some content around this and educate y'all on it.
Yeah. I mean, we can do a lot of things.
Cool. As long as you're not taking out chunks of my muscle, I'm game. So it sounds like
they tell you, oh, it's so small. It's like the size of a eraser. You'll recover.
No, I saw that needle.
Dude, I was sore when I had it done to me. I was sore for like, in even, it was like months when I would like, people, my colleagues are going to be so mad at me because potential subjects could be this. Be like, what? But like when I would push on it and palpate it, it was probably like 6 months before that knot went away. It's like,
yeah, man. Yeah.
Anyway, it's super cool.
Yeah.
They're fun to do.
Thanks a
and
bunch,
they're fun
Kyle.
to analyze. Yeah, my pleasure. And the lab thing would be awesome. And you can check out our
Cool.
lab. People can check out our lab. It's eou.edu/leap. And
Cool.
you can see sort of the lab service. We have precision hydration tests, so we can do your sweat.
Ooh, yep.
We have lactate, VO2. We have a full we have the kicker bike, but also a kicker trainer. So you can bring your bike, or we can set up all your
Cool.
components on the big simulator bike. We have
treadmill.
We also have all the stuff, the Moxie monitors, so we can look at local blood flow and oxygen saturation locally.
This will be fun.
Yeah,
this will be great.
It's great. We have saliva cortisol. We can look at how stressed you are before, during, and after. We can look at
that sounds good.
It's super fun.
Charts.
There's a bunch of stuff we can do. So.
Well, thanks, Kyle, and thanks everybody for listening. If
thanks
you appreciated. Of course, man. If you appreciated this episode, all those to the listeners here, you can share and rate the podcast. If we have a constant flow of ratings and everything else that comes in, that's what makes more people discover the podcast, because algorithms rank it higher. So we'd appreciate that. And if you want to check us out on YouTube, you can do that. Exciting things coming here from TrainerRoad, which maybe you've already heard about them, depending on when things come out. I might add something to the beginning of this episode. So I'm probably sounding silly right now. But anyways, go check it out. It's awesome. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan.